Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. I'm the author of several books on the Garmin G1000, 3000, 5000, and Perspective Glass cockpits, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. This show is a tribute to my friend Alan Brown, who was the chief designer and later program manager for the F-117A stealth fighter. Alan passed away 2 weeks ago, and today I'll play an interview I did with him a couple of years before I started this podcast, in which he talks about designing the stealth fighter. Last week in episode 234, we talked with Seth Lake about expense sharing and illegal charters, something all pilots need to understand to comply with the FARs. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/234. And this is a listener-supported show, so we are ad-free. But I would like to encourage you to sign up to become a member to help support the show. You can do that by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And when you do, you can get some of the goodies that you'll read about on the website, and I'll read your name on the show. This week in the news, we have an update on the Cessna 172 that crashed on a bridge in Miami a few weeks ago. Another pilot is arrested for using a false identity, and this time it's a woman. And finally, a farmer is in trouble for disabling a number of automated weather systems, one of them at an airport, and we'll tell you why he did it. All this and more, and the news starts now. From avweb.com, update on the Miami bridge crash. The preliminary NTSB report is out on the crash of a Cessna 172 on a bridge in Miami that we talked about in episode 232. That crash killed a Miami air traffic controller. The report notes that the fuel tank selector valve was between the both and right positions on the Cessna 172 that collided with two vehicles in an emergency landing on a bridge in Miami on May 14th. The crash killed the pilot and injured two passengers and 5 people in one of the vehicles. This was the only obvious anomaly with the aircraft mentioned in the NTSB's preliminary report on the accident. Although the fuel valve was out of position, there was fuel in the line to the carburetor, which was functioning normally. The engine had compression on all cylinders, and the ignition system was fine. The throttle was pushed all the way in, the mixture was full rich, and the carburetor heat was turned off. Now, the NTSB report said nothing about carburetor ice, but I was curious if the conditions at the time were favorable for carb ice. So I looked up the METARs for nearby airports at the time of the accidents, and I pulled up a carb ice chart. The temperature and dew point at the time of the crash were squarely in the middle of the blue area of the graph, which is described as icing at glide and cruise power. So it's possible this aircraft did experience carburetor ice. As you probably know, if you are flying an aircraft with a carbureted engine and you suspect carb ice, you should pull the carb heat control. Signs of carb ice include decreasing RPM and/or a rough engine. But here's something you may not know. When you experience carb ice and pull the carb heat control, your RPM will decrease even further. So it may seem to some pilots that pulling the carb heat control made the situation worse, and they might push the carb heat control back in, which would be the wrong thing to do. Instead, if you wait long enough, the engine RPM will eventually increase as the carb heat melts the ice. And when the RPM is back close to normal, then you can push the carb heat control back in. And if you have any questions about this, talk with your flight instructor. From planeandpilotmag.com, NTSB factual report, pilot in STOL Fatal Crash Warned before accident to lower your nose. The pilot of a vintage Cessna 140 taildragger who perished in a stall spin accident during an impromptu short takeoff and landing event in Nebraska last month was warned on 2 occasions to, quote, lower your nose as he was on short final for landing, this according to the NTSB's preliminary report on the crash. The traditional STOL contest, which grades contestants on the total length of their takeoff and landing rolls, was being flown after high winds scrubbed the planned STOL drag event, in which planes race at very low altitude in a straight line and back again to a short landing. The first 2 patterns and landings for each of the planes in the group the accident airplane was in were uneventful, but on the 3rd circuit, the Cessna 140's speed seemed slower, and its altitude was lower than the airplane it was following in the circuit. The report reads, quote, during the 3rd approach with the accident airplane on final approach, and following a Zenith STOL 701 also on final, the accident airplane descended and appeared to be lower than the airplane ahead. Subsequently, the pitch increased, the plane rolled to the right and completed a 3/4 turn right spin and impacted terrain in a near vertical attitude. The race official that was operating the radio during the event noticed the slow speed and nose-high attitude of the Cessna 140, and according to the report, about 45 seconds prior to the accident, he stated over the radio to the accident pilot, "Lower your nose, you look slow." About 15 seconds before the accident, he stated again to the pilot, "Lower your nose." There were no communications received from the accident pilot. Shortly thereafter, the Cessna 140 stalled and entered a spin. The pilot was killed on impact. And you probably heard that the President and First Lady were briefly evacuated from their Rehoboth Beach, Delaware residence a week ago after a small plane mistakenly entered a TFR around that location. The President was moved to a secure location, which was identified in many of the reports, which would seem to make that secure location a little less secure in the future now that everyone knows where it is. Now, one of the most interesting comments I read about this TFR bust came from the Pilots of America website. One of the commenters wrote, apparently a lot of the early busts, so those that happened years ago, were pilots at small airports under the TFR who knew the floor where radar coverage started at their airport. They'd go out to do pattern work figuring they'd be invisible, but the airborne radar they hadn't anticipated would pick them up. And a lot of us have figured out the approximate minimum altitude at which we can be picked up at our home airport. But just because you stay below that altitude doesn't mean you won't get caught if there's a TFR over your airport. So, yet again, one more reason to follow the rules so you don't have your pilot certificate suspended. From AOPA.org, straight-in landings and FAR 91.113G. Now, this story refers to a question they received asking whether there was an official FAA interpretation regarding 91.113G. And just to refresh your memory, that regulation says in part, when two or more aircraft are approaching an aircraft for the purpose of landing, the aircraft at the lower altitude has the right of way, but it shall not take advantage of this rule to cut in front of another which is on final approach to land or to overtake that aircraft. And in response, they said, and the question had to do with whether there was an interpretation about whether aircraft already established on final have right-of-way over aircraft which have not yet turned final, even if the other aircraft is already lower. The answer is yes, and there is an official precedent case on point which solidifies the FAA's interpretation. The FAA says this regulation means, short of an emergency, an aircraft already established on final does have right-of-way over an aircraft not yet on final, e.g. on downwind or base, and the second aircraft may not turn in front of the aircraft on final if that will force the aircraft on final to alter or abandon its approach. And they say, note that Mr. Fecke was subject to not just a suspension but an emergency revocation for admittedly, knowingly, and deliberately cutting off an aircraft on a straight-in final, forcing it to abandon its approach. Now, this doesn't mean that if there's a plane on a 10-mile straight-in doing 80 knots, you must extend to get behind it. Right-of-way and 91.113G are only issues if turning in front of the aircraft on final would create a conflict and force that aircraft to alter or abandon its approach to avoid a collision. Of course, it would still be both prudent and polite to discuss this on CTAF before you do it, but that's not a regulatory issue. And from GeneralAviationNews.com, Cessna 182 hits severe wake turbulence from military transport. And this comes from an ASRS NASA pilot report. The pilot reported that aircraft Y, a military transport, was flying south in front of us quite a distance, approximately 10 to 15 miles. ADS-B and data from my Garmin GDL-50 in ForeFlight stated he was 200 feet below us. It appeared he was at our elevation or maybe slightly higher, but was hard to tell for sure due to the distance and size of the aircraft. I flew along in my Cessna 182 north of Pueblo Memorial Airport in Colorado as aircraft Y made a right turn to line up with a runway at Colorado Springs Municipal Airport. I was thinking about wake turbulence from their aircraft, but with the data I had, we were above them and should be no factor. A few minutes later, we hit severe wake turbulence, causing the airplane to violently roll to the left while losing altitude. I reacted quickly and kept the airplane level and under control. There were no injuries or damage, but there certainly could have been as my passenger hit their head on the interior. As aircraft Y approached Colorado Springs, its ADS-B said they were level with us, but Colorado Springs would have been a couple thousand feet below, so something is amiss with either their ADS-B or the radar rebroadcast. From InternationalAirportReview.com, FAA's BATC campaign to recruit the next generation of air traffic controllers. The FAA has launched BATC, a recruiting campaign to hire the next generation of air traffic controllers. The application window will be open nationwide from the 24th to the 27th of June 2022 for all eligible U.S. citizens. Applicants must be U.S. citizens, speak English clearly, and be no older than 30 years old with limited exceptions. They must have either 3 years of general work experience or 4 years of education leading to a bachelor's degree or a combination of both. Applicants must also pass the Air Traffic Skills Assessment. Individuals who are selected are also required to pass all pre-employment requirements, including medical examination, security investigation, and drug test. Selected candidates will train at the FAA Academy in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. After successful completion of training, they will be placed in a radar facility or air traffic tower. Staffing needs will determine facility assignment, and applicants must be willing to work anywhere in the U.S. The FAA hired 509 new controllers in fiscal 2021, and they plan to hire more than 4,800 controllers over the next 5 years. From GeneralAviationNews.com, 4 people in a 3-seat Piper ends in crash. The pilot was departing in his float-equipped 3-seat Piper PA-12 with 4 souls on board. After departure and during the initial climb, the right wing hit a tree. The airplane rotated 180 degrees and hit terrain near Palmer, Alaska, sustaining substantial damage to the wings, lift struts, fuselage, and left horizontal stabilizer. In a conversation with the NTSB investigator shortly after the accident, the pilot provided weights that equated to a gross weight of about 2,011 pounds or 173 pounds over the plane's approved maximum gross takeoff weight. In the NTSB reporting form, the pilot reported that the gross weight at the time of the accident was 1,845 or 7 pounds over its maximum takeoff gross weight limit. In the recommendation section of the NTSB form, the pilot stated the accident may have been prevented if he had taken a lighter load or less fuel. Probable cause, according to the NTSB, quote, the pilot's improper decision to load the airplane beyond its allowable gross weight limits, which resulted in an impact with a tree and collision with terrain. And to that I'll add he obviously broke the FARs because he had 4 people in a plane that was limited to 3 people. From ARRL.org, FCC proposes record $34,000 fine for alleged interference in unauthorized transmissions during Idaho wildfire. The FCC has proposed a $3,400 fine against Jason Frawley of Lewiston, Idaho, for allegedly interfering with the radio operations of the U.S. Forest Service during firefighting activities for the Johnson Creek fire near Elk River in July 2021. The FCC stated that Frawley holds an extra-class amateur radio service license, WA7CQ, and is the owner-operator of Leader Communications, a licensee of 8 microwave licenses and 1 business license. The FCC alleges that on July 17, 2021, using his amateur handheld radio, Frawley transmitted 5 times, and on July 18th, he transmitted 3 times on frequencies allocated and authorized for government use, apparently causing harmful interference with his unlawful transmissions. The frequencies with which Frawley is alleged to have interfered with were being used to coordinate firefighting crews from the U.S. Forest Service and the Idaho Department of Land to fight the 1,000-acre Johnson Creek fire, including the communications between fire suppressant aircraft and ground crews. Frawley admitted to transmitting on government frequencies. He argued that he was not trying to cause interference, but instead was transmitting to provide information to the firefighters. Quote, at no time was I trying to disturb any other communications or air traffic. I was honestly just giving them information I had, since I have been working on the Butte since the early 90s. The FCC, however, concluded that Frawley's admitted unauthorized transmissions on frequencies for which he did not have a license had the potential to cause substantial harm to life and property. A news release from the FCC states the fine is the largest of its kind they've proposed. From thenationalnews.com, pilot in Istanbul airport crash arrested. The pilot of a plane that crashed earlier this year at an Istanbul airport, killing 3 passengers, has been arrested on charges of involuntary manslaughter and causing injury, according to Turkey's state-run news agency. The Pegasus Airlines Boeing 737 ran off the runway at Istanbul's airport on February 5th, crashed into a ditch, and broke apart while landing in bad weather. Some 180 passengers and crew members were injured in the crash that saw passengers scramble through the split fuselage to escape. Prosecutors investigating the crash interrogated the pilot following his discharge from a hospital where he had been treated. A court in Istanbul later ordered the pilot, identified only as initials M.A., to be arrested pending trial. The crash happened as the 11-year-old aircraft landed in strong winds and heavy rain. Pegasus has had several recent instances of overshooting runways. And from AustralianFlying.com, Australian civil registration to include numbers. CASA announced that it would change Australia's civil aircraft registrations to an alphanumeric system that would include numbers as well as letters. The move is being made to create more registrations than were possible under the simple VH-ABC system. Quote, soon we'll be introducing a 3-character alphanumeric combination such as VH-2AB, VH-A9B, VH-A22. Now, I think that's good news for the Australians. I like having numbers available in our call signs here in the U.S. because it makes them shorter to say, because most numbers are just a single syllable, whereas most of the letters in a registration are read out phonetically, and that's often 3 or more syllables per letter. From paddleyourown.canoe.com, woman stole identity of dead baby to get pilot certificate and swindle $1.5 million in pandemic relief funds. Now, about a year ago on Aviation News Talk, we covered the story of a Florida pilot who had lived for many years using a stolen identity, and he broke federal law because he used that identity to get a pilot certificate and a passport. And now we have a story about a woman who faces the threat of spending 30 years in prison for stealing the identity of a deceased baby so she could become a private jet flight attendant and swindle the U.S. government out of $1.5 million in fraudulent Paycheck Protection Program loans during the pandemic. Ava Missildine, 49, of Columbus, Ohio, has been accused by federal prosecutors of stealing the identity of a baby that died in 1979. Prosecutors allege Missildine assumed the identity of the baby in 2003 and used it for the next 13 years until an investigation was launched last year. The deceased baby's identity was also used by Missildine to obtain a passport and a student pilot's license, a first-class medical certificate, and to gain admission into Ohio State University. Missildine had already duped the airline into employing her under the fake identity. During the pandemic, she's alleged to have taken criminal advantage of pandemic relief schemes by using both her real and fake identities to apply for fraudulent Paycheck Protection Program loans for $1.5 million for bakeries she no longer owned. If found guilty, she faces a statutory minimum of 2 years behind bars and up to 30 years in prison. And finally, from 9news.com, how farmers' crime with pie pans led to a federal felony case. Farmers love it when it rains, especially in southeast Colorado, where severe drought conditions continue to persist. But for farmer Trey Jaggers, the rain became his nemesis. Federal records that name Jaggers and 3 other unknown conspirators describe a plot to damage and tamper with 8 federally owned rain gauges in Colorado and Kansas. The group's goal was to disrupt the official record of rain in order to fool insurance programs that pay farmers for losses when there is a lack of rain. According to federal court records, the group used pie pans, hammers, and silicone to prevent rain gauges from collecting water. They poked holes in the gauges, tipped them over, or sometimes cut wires, records show. The plea agreement indicates at least 8 rain gauges in Colorado and Kansas were either tampered with or damaged. On 14 occasions, government employees made note of the damages, according to court records. Colorado State climatologist Russ Schumacher and a few of his fellow scientists had to make note of the missing data in the official records, he told 9 News. Quote, "It's just not the sort of case that I think any of us have dealt with before," Schumacher said of the missing data, adding that sometimes rain gauges break, but that intentional disruptions are unusual. Schumacher said that while the missing data does not have a significant impact on the official record, it does slightly cloud how wet the area was during those years. According to the plea agreement, at least one of the rain gauges that was tampered with was owned by the FAA at an airport in La Junta, Colorado. In a statement, Jaggers said, "Today I pled guilty in court because my involvement in this case was wrong. I regret my actions and will work to make amends for the harm I have caused." He's expected to be sentenced in September and could face up to 5 years in prison. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates and then my interview with Alan Brown about designing the F-117 stealth fighter. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. I've got a couple of simple flying tips to pass along to you, but first let me mention real briefly, we have a brand new 2022 SR20 that's just come on the flight line at the West Valley Flying Club where I teach in Palo Alto, California. Now, it's the first plane that I've ever flown that doesn't have a wet compass in it. And when I went to look for the compass, I remembered reading a story on the show here last year that the FAA had eliminated the requirements for a wet compass in some new glass cockpit aircraft. Anyway, I'll talk more about my first flight on that aircraft in a few minutes. And if you would like to fly it, please contact me. Now, as I get into the tips, I should first mention that I've been doing a lot of flying at Cessna 182s for the past couple of weeks. Partially that's because some of our rental Cirrus aircraft have been down for maintenance for a few weeks. Now, this first tip applies to people flying virtually any version of the Cessna 182, 206, or Cessna 210, and possibly a few other Cessna models. All of these aircraft have a rudder trim wheel that's located just above the elevator pitch trim wheel, and it's easy to identify it because it's mounted horizontally. So to change the rudder trim, you grab onto the wheel and move it left or right, versus the elevator pitch trim wheel, which you would roll up or down. Now, the rudder trim wheel is also much smaller than the elevator trim wheel. I was doing a night flight recently with one of our Patreon mega supporters in a Cessna 182, and I mentioned a tip about using the rudder trim, which he said in all of his years of flying in a 182 he'd never heard mentioned before, so I thought it might be new to a few of you as well. By the way, you end up needing to change the rudder trim pretty much whenever you make a significant speed change, such as when you transition from level flight to a climb or to a descent or vice versa. There are two ways to notice that you need to adjust the trim. One is that when the autopilot is on and the rudder trim is misset, one of the wings will be lower than the other in flight. Now, the other way you'll notice is that the ball or slid skip indicator isn't centered. To fix it, some pilots just grab the rudder trim wheel and start turning it, but what I noticed years ago is that unless you move the rudder trim really slowly, the airplane jerks left or right when you move the wheel. So the tip I passed along is that instead what you should first do is to apply whatever rudder pressure is needed on one of the rudder pedals to first center the ball or slid skip indicator. Then turn the rudder trim wheel to dial away the pressure you're holding on one of the rudder pedals. As you turn the wheel, you'll also slowly remove pressure from the rudder pedal so that the ball or slid skip indicator remains centered. And I think you'll find in general that that technique results in a smoother, less jerky ride for you and your passengers as you adjust the rudder trim. And here's tip number 2, which applies to virtually all pilots, or at least those of you who wear a typical GA headset when you fly. I noticed the other day when listening to a pilot talk over the intercom that he was barely audible, and I suspected that perhaps the boom microphone that's part of his headset had become twisted and the mic element was no longer pointed toward his mouth. Now, of course, the mic element is usually covered by a black foam windscreen, which makes it impossible to see if the microphone isn't oriented correctly. And like this gentleman, you may not even have been aware that there's a proper orientation to the boom microphone of a headset. But of course, it does have an orientation. If you think about a handheld microphone, you know that you need to talk into the top of the microphone, not the side or the bottom of the microphone. And the same is true with a boom microphone on a headset. Now here's what you do to get it oriented properly. Just squeeze the foam on your headset's microphone, and you'll notice that the microphone inside the foam is not round like the foam that covers it. When you squeeze it, you'll find the microphone has 2 flat sides, making it somewhat rectangular in shape at the end of the microphone. The mic element is located in one of the wide flat sides. So in most cases, all you need to do is squeeze the foam on the microphone with your thumb and index finger, then grip the microphone and twist it so that one of the large flat sides is facing directly toward your mouth. If you only have to twist the microphone a few degrees, then most likely the correct flat side, the one with the mic element, is now pointed at your mouth. However, there is a small chance that the mic has rotated 180 degrees out of position and that you are now talking into the wrong flat side, which is the back of the microphone. If you have any doubt, just pull off the foam and look at the flat side pointed at your mouth. It will typically have a few slits in it so that the air pressure coming from your mouth as you speak hits the mic element. Now, the wrong side of the mic typically will have no openings on it, or it will have a much smaller opening than the slits on the correct side of the microphone. So I hope that helps you with better communications when you fly. Getting back to the new SR20 that we have on the flight line, the very first rental flight in that aircraft was one I flew a couple of days ago with Catherine Cavagnaro. Now, she was visiting her family here in the San Francisco Bay Area, so we met up at the airport to say hello. And after we talked for a while, I suggested we go flying in that new SR20. Although Catherine grew up in the Bay Area, she got her pilot's certificate after she moved away, and she has never flown GA aircraft in the area here. So I took her on what's called the Bay Tour, which is essentially a loop that we fly around an area that takes us over the Golden Gate Bridge, over Alcatraz, and next to the downtown area of San Francisco. Typically, it takes about an hour, but FlightAware shows that we were in the air for just 36 minutes. That's because this aircraft is so new that Cirrus recommends it be flown at 85% power as part of the break-in process for the new engine. So this was my first ever high-speed bay tour. And according to FlightAware, we hit 186 knots ground speed at one point, which is a speed more typical of an SR-22 than an SR-20. I also shot video of our flight, and I haven't looked at it yet, but I may edit it and make it available to our Patreon supporters who've signed up to support this show. Speaking of Patreon videos, last week I posted one which is part 2 of my tutorial on how to do a circle to land correctly. In it, I explained one of the visual illusions that gets instrument pilots in trouble when they circle, and I also ran through some of the math to show the effect of bank angle and speed on an aircraft's turn radius, and how you need to space yourself out on the downwind so that you don't end up overshooting the base to final turn, which can then result in a stall spin accident. That math is also helpful for pilots when flying a standard VFR traffic pattern so that they avoid overshooting the base to final turn. Also last week, I did a mountain checkout for a client in a Cessna 182. The mountain checkout is a requirement at the West Valley Flying Club that I teach at. We're required to go to 2 high-altitude airports and 1 airport with unusual terrain. And we also have to do 2 landings at each of those airports. We flew first to Truckee, which is at about 5,900 foot elevation. The density altitude when we arrived was 7,400 feet, so we went through the leaning process before taking off and making another trip around the pattern. And I've created 2 videos from that trip, one flying to Truckee from the west, and another one showing our second trip around the pattern, which was rather convoluted because of a runway change that we were given in the air. And I'll post both of those videos in the coming weeks for people who've joined as members to support the show. We then flew across Lake Tahoe and landed at the South Lake Tahoe Airport, which is at about 6,200 feet above sea level and surrounded by much taller mountains. After our second trip around the pattern, we flew to Oscar 22, the Columbia Airport, which has a much lower field elevation, but which does have a pretty tall hill on short final to runway 17. Now you can fly straight in over the hill, but I typically approach the numbers from an angle to avoid the hill. And in the process, I'm showing pilots that the standard rectangular traffic pattern is sometimes not the safest path to fly if you have high terrain near an airport. In total, I shot 388 gigabytes of video on that trip, and I've only looked at the video from the first of the 3 airports, so you'll probably see more video from that trip in the weeks ahead. Now, I saw an interesting YouTube video this week that I wanted to tell you about. It was of an experimental light sport seaplane that had an engine failure at 600 feet AGL soon after it took off from the Williamsburg Airport in Virginia. The instructor pilot on board reacted immediately by lowering the nose and checking his auxiliary fuel pump, and he noted that he had no fuel pressure. He landed in a cornfield in front of him, and later an FAA inspector confirmed the loss of fuel pressure was due to a cracked fuel rail. And I've included a link to that video in our show notes in case you'd like to watch how the instructor handled that engine out approach. And now see if you know any of these people who have signed up to support the show. Aviation is a small community, so you probably know at least one of them. We have a brand new mega supporter who I'll tell you more about in the future, and that's Rick Crockett. He edited his pledge up from $20 to $50 a month. And we have a couple of other people who edited their pledges up. They include Joseph Schuchart, who edited up to $8 a month, Andrew Dury, who edited up to $20 a month, and Eric Hecht, who edited up to $8 a month. We have several new people who've signed up at the $20 a month level, so they'll be able to see all of the videos I post. Those include Gary Hagan, Stephen Siska, Douglas Hudson, and Foster Das. And we have several other new members, including Dimitri Stefanonidis and Charlie Heilman. Thanks so much for signing up to support the show. And if you'd like to join to become a member or support the show, as so many other people have, you can just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. There you can read about the various goodies that you get at the different dollar levels, and you can choose a dollar level at which you'd like to support the show. Or if you'd prefer to donate via PayPal, simply go to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal, where you can enter a one-time donation or a regular monthly donation via credit card. Coming up next, my conversation with Alan Brown, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. I don't know how to start this other than to say that a rather remarkable man named Alan Brown passed away 2 weeks ago, and that I was lucky enough to be able to spend a lot of time with him over the last 9 years. Alan was really an engineer's engineer. He was brilliant in the field of aerospace engineering, and although he'd had a very long career and had worked on many projects, he'll always be remembered best as the chief designer of the F-117 stealth fighter and later as its program manager. 7 years ago, I interviewed Alan for a segment on the Airplane Geeks podcast that I co-host, and I'll play that interview again in a moment. Alan and I met and became friends in an unusual way. About 9 years ago, my wife became interested in learning to fly RC planes, something I didn't really have a lot of interest in, but I figured it would be something fun to do together, and it's turned out to be the case. We have great fun doing it. We fly with the RCBs group, which has a paved field in Watsonville, California, and it turns out that Alan was also a member of the club. Even though he was in his mid-80s when we met, he was active as the club's secretary, and he also produced the club's newsletter. Now, the newsletter was unique among RC Club newsletters in that Alan would write articles on esoteric aerospace engineering concepts that went over my head and probably the heads of just about every other member of the club. But we all learned from the articles, and we all enjoyed interacting with Alan on weekends down at the field. Most of the pilots there, including my wife and I, fly off-the-shelf foam airplanes, which are easy to assemble and also fairly easy to fly. A few people, such as Alan, would build their own aircraft, but Alan's planes were in a class of their own. He specialized in making replicas of some of the earliest airplanes to fly during the dawn of aviation more than 100 years ago. Now, these were delicate contraptions that could only be flown in very low wind, and we were all delighted in watching Alan get these airplanes into the sky and then back onto the ground in one piece. Well, most of the time anyway, in one piece. Talking with Alan was fascinating. He told me lots of stories, and I always hung on every word. For example, up until the last couple of years, Alan was actively presenting and was at times called in to consult on projects for the government. He was often asked how the F-117 was designed and deployed so quickly, while other projects like the F-22 and F-35 fighter took so long to design and deploy. He said that the design time was proportional to the number of people on the Air Force Design Committee. In the case of the F-117, there were only 6 people on the committee, but the F-22 had more than 100 people on the committee. And he said to me that every captain or major on the committee wanted to have his or her idea included so that it would be a feather in their cap for their next promotion. And hence the F-22 took much longer to design and deploy. He also thought there was a major flaw in the F-35 design that added tremendous cost to the program. In the 1960s, when the fighter was first being designed, the Navy and Air Force wanted replacements for their F-14s and F-15s respectively. Rather than build 2 new aircraft types, each with a lower volume, the Defense Department believed they could save money through economies of scale by building a single fighter in higher volumes by combining the Navy and Air Force requirements into a single design. But Alan said the general rule of thumb at the time was that aircraft cost about $1,000 per pound to produce, and that if the Navy and Air Force got separate designs that met their own requirements, the jets would have each weighed around 40,000 pounds. But when the requirements for the jets were combined into a single design, the weight of that design zoomed up to 70,000 pounds. The estimated cost savings of building 400 jets of a single design versus building 200 jets of 2 different designs was only about 10%. But that cost savings was totally swamped out by having a much more heavier and hence more expensive aircraft. There's an excellent oral history available online from a conversation that Peter Westwick had with Alan in his home in 2010, and I'll include a link to it in the show notes. Here's some excerpts from the oral history. Alan told me about some of these things, and others were totally new to me as I read the transcript. Alan was born in 1929 in England. At the age of 15, he became an apprentice at Blackburn Aircraft, and he stayed there for 5 years. He said, "I did 2 years working in 8 different shops in the company, like woodworking, metalworking, final assembly, machine shop, stuff like that. At the same time, I went to 2 years of evening classes, and then 2.5 years full-time with the local technical college to get what was called a higher national diploma in engineering. Afterward, he attended Cranford University to do what was the equivalent of a master's degree. He said, I did that from 1950 to 52, so by the time I was 22 years old, I had a master's. He then worked for the Bristol Airplane Company. In 1956, he came to the U.S. and was a research associate and lecturer at the University of Southern California. He joined Lockheed in 1960, starting in the physics laboratory of the Lockheed Missiles and Space Company in Palo Alto. He moved to Lockheed's aircraft company in Burbank in 1966, working on propulsion installation on the supersonic transport and the FX and VSX aircraft, which later became the F-15 and S-3A respectively. From 1975 to 1989, he was a member of the Lockheed Advanced Development Projects, better known as Skunk Works. He served first as deputy program manager for the Have Blue Low Observable Research Aircraft before becoming program manager and chief engineer for the F-117A stealth fighter from initial concept until the first production aircraft was built from the 1978 to 1982 timeframe. From 1982 to 1989, he was director of low observable technology, and he retired in 1992 as the director of engineering at Lockheed Corporate Headquarters. Now here's the conversation I recorded with Alan Brown. We were at the RCB's field, which is in a beautiful location sandwiched between farm fields and the banks of the Pajaro River. We took 2 lawn chairs, placed them under shade trees next to the river, and we talked into a handheld audio recorder. Here's that conversation. I'm sitting here today with Alan Brown. Alan has at various points in time been the program manager and also the chief designer of the F-117 stealth fighter, and I know that he also finished his career at Lockheed as the director of engineering. And did I get that right, or did I get some of those incorrect?
That's correct. The director of engineering was at corporate specifically, and not overall for the entire corporation. It was just it was a roving job where I went from different companies, one to another, trying to give good advice or receive it.
Well, you've been involved with some very exciting programs. Tell me, what was, let's just kind of go back to the late 60s, early 70s. What was the problem that was identified with our bombing strategy that ultimately led to the need for a stealth technology?
I think there were two things. One is it was pretty clear just from looking at early warning systems that the Soviets had at that time, particularly Tall King and Spoon Rest, that our B-52s had absolutely no chance of breaking through the outer defenses, which would be in the northern part of Russia and Siberia, because we would be typically coming across the pole from the United States. So the feeling was that as a strategic bomber situation, we were absolutely unable to penetrate Soviet defenses. Now, that was compounded also by the Egyptian-Israeli war of about that same time period, when the Israelis lost a very large number of F-4 fighters to surface-to-air missiles, which had been supplied by the Soviets to Egypt. So the combination of those two things led people to realize that we just were not being very effective at penetrating either with long-range bombers or with short-range attack aircraft.
So give me an idea, if the bombers were going over the poles, how long would it take before the Soviets, noticed what was going on?
Well, a very typical situation is you're flying at 35,000 feet, and at that altitude, the horizon is about 200 miles away, and you can typically be seen as you cross the horizon. So 200 miles for a B-52 is 20 minutes, and so that's tons of time to call on any kind of defense system to shoot down the weapons.
And then tell me a little bit about cross-section. How what would you compare B-52 cross-section to, and what would it have to be to get stealthy?
Let's talk about not so much what the size of the B-52 cross-section is. It's several football fields, because we measure these things in square meters. And that, I think, is one of the big issues as to why people had not really taken radar cross-section reduction seriously. The biggest issue is that the radar basic equation says that as you reduce the range, then the radar cross-section has to go down by the fourth power. So typically, if I want to reduce the range of detection by a factor of 2, I've got to reduce the radar cross-section by a factor of 16.
And what about an F-15, for example? What does that look like on radar?
F-15, for instance, air-to-air is about 10 square meters. And if you look at the thing nose on, the inlets, for example, actually take up about all of that 10 square meters, because conventional inlets just shine like headlight beams back at the radar that they were illuminated by.
And tell me about the competition that led to Lockheed and Northrop competing for one of the early stealth prototype designs.
Yeah, we were involved in a program called XST, and to be fair, we got into it by accident because it's very difficult when you have a top secret operation like the Lockheed Skunk Works for everybody to know about it well enough to be able to issue a request for a proposal. So we were not even considered at first by DARPA in that initial set. But when we finally got into it, it was just us versus Northrop, and we won a competition for a single-seat stealthy airplane that was capable of about 1 hour's duration, so strictly a technology demonstrator.
And when you went out to test this at Area 51, what kinds of things happened there for the competition?
When we went to Area 51, we had already won the competition from Northrop by making full-size scale models, which were tested at the White Sands radar testing site that the U.S. Air Force had. And having won that competition for a full-size device, we then went on to make a complete airplane, obviously the same scale, flew that at Area 51, and had a pretty interesting first attempt at demonstrating our low radar cross-section. The Air Force, of course, also has the very top radar capability in the country at that same place. So we were going against the best radars that were available. And on a particular day, we said, okay, for our test, we will come over that hill in a certain direction. We pointed out the azimuth angle of the hill. We'll be at approximately 500 feet altitude, and we will cross over the hill at 3 p.m. So you don't have to look for the airplane. You can be just pointing there, and that'll be where it is. So then you can see just how well you can detect it. I was with the radar people that following day, and at 3 o'clock came and went, and the radar guy said, "Oh, I guess you missed your timing. You didn't get here on time. You must be late." And at that time, they also had a visual telescope lined up parallel to the radar, and the guy on visual about that time said, "Hey, I've just picked up your airplane. It's 12 miles out and it's coming in at 500 feet. At which point, of course, the radar people started kicking the radar and thought they were out of line or something. But the real answer was that they were pointing the right direction and just never saw the airplane.
So the shape on the F-117 is very unusual. Tell me about the various angles and why those are important.
Okay, first of all, sharp edges are pretty important in a horizontal line. So a horizontal perimeter of the airplane is all sharp edges. The reason why the HAV Blue, which is the name given to our experimental stealth technology XST airplane, was all flat facets, is because that's all our computer program was able to handle, was flat surfaces for radar return. And that's a very computer-intensive thing, and it was only because of the advanced computer stage in the mid-1970s that allowed us to do this. But at that time, we were not able to calculate curved surface radar return, which didn't really get accomplished satisfactorily till the early 80s.
And what about the shape? If you look down on it, slightly bat wing, but a number of cutouts. Tell us about the shape.
Okay, very basically, you want to eliminate any lines on the airplane which are at right angles to the direction of the radar, because any lines, even if they've got absorption material on them, and even if they're sharp, will give some kind of return. And so you want to avoid having those at right angles to the flight direction. So, for instance, every line on the airplane has to be swept back considerably. And based on the competition that we'd had earlier between us and Northrop, we had a requirement to have the minimum amount of return off the nose and tail in 90-degree sectors, which meant 45 degrees sweep back or more on all surfaces.
And so it's designated an F-117. Obviously, it's a fighter, and yet it's used to drop bombs. How did that come about?
Oh, that's pretty straightforward. The way in which pilots were recruited for this program was by four-star General Bob Dixon, who was in charge of TAC, calling his top pilots in Tactical Air Command and say, I've got a wonderful job available for you. I can't tell you anything about it, but I'm sure you'll love it. Do you want to join? Well, of course, all the crack fighter pilots joined. The guy who was picked as squadron leader for this group was a guy called Bob Jackson, nicknamed Burner Bob Jackson because of his use of his afterburner so much. And he was the top of the Air Force aerobatic team at that time. So he was there really the top pilot in Tactical Air Command. And he got to handpick his own people for this thing. Well, of course, the reason why it became an F airplane and not an A airplane, which is what it really should have been, is that no self-respecting fighter pilot is going to fly anything other than an F airplane. You certainly can't get a good fighter pilot to fly an A or, worse still, a B.
Good recruiting tactic there. So I understand there was one F-17 that was lost in combat. Can you tell us about why that happened?
Yeah, that got me very upset. I got a telephone call from ABC Discovery Channel about three milliseconds after the accident to ask me what had happened to my airplane. And as it turned out, I guessed correctly because I was told later what really happened. The airplane was flying out of Italy over Kosovo and fighting against the Serbs, and one of the things that you have to think about with a revolutionary airplane, which is rather than an evolutionary one, is that when you have a revolutionary airplane, you have revolutionary tactics, and you do not fly the airplane like you've flown everything else before it, just a little bit better. Unfortunately, the NATO command was all European generals who were their experience with tornadoes, which are low-level flying, and they get their, quote, stealthy characteristics by flying very close to the ground and try to have radar cover in that way. And that is not appropriate for the F-117, which should have been flying at between 12 and 15,000 feet at 1G altitude, 1G level flight, because you do not want to put that airplane into a 2G turn close to enemy radars, because a 2G turn is more than 60 degrees bank angle, and suddenly you're looking at the whole bottom of the airplane as a reflector. So the airplane is designed to have very low radar cross-section in about a plus or minus 25 degree elevation angle. You also take care that you do not fly the same path in successive days, and that was one of our Air Force requirements. So we're flying at 12 to 15,000 feet, 1G, and at not the same flight path in successive days, which is what we've done very successfully in the Iraq War of 1991-92. And in Kosovo, being a more mountainous region, and also with generals who were accustomed to tornadoes, we had the airplane flying through mountain passes, doing large banked turns and repeating the same path in successive days. And in fact, it was a flight plan of that sort done on the third day after having done the same flight path 2 previous days that pretty much told the enemy which way we're coming. And also, not being like a conventional war, in as much as the Yugoslav people were able to be with their cell phones at the Italian airfields and were able to call home and say, the F-117s are just taking off right now. You should see them in just about 23 minutes. So altogether, a very bad use of the airplane and very unsuccessful. As a little extra on that, one of the hardest parts for our fighter pilots is to not yank and bank as soon as they've dropped their weapons or done the job that they're supposed to do. And when they were flying over Baghdad and Iraq, the tough part was to be able to fly out after they dropped their weapons and then come out at about a 20-degree bank angle maximum, so to keep the stealth level down, which meant they were flying it like a Boeing 707 instead of like the fighters they were all used to.
Revolutionary plan definitely needs revolutionary tactics.
Yeah.
Great. Alan Brown, thanks so much for telling us about the F-17 stealth fighter, and congratulations on having made major contributions to such a marvelous airplane.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's been my pleasure to chat with you today.
One of the other stories Alan told me that I really liked is about the first competition between Northrop and Lockheed to see which of their prototypes perform better when tested for their radar cross-section, which is the amount of energy that's reflected from the airplane when it's struck by radar. The test was to be done on the radar test range at White Sands in New Mexico, and the prototypes were to be mounted on top of a pole so that they could get accurate radar cross-section or RCS measurements. When the Lockheed team looked at the pole, they realized that the pole would reflect more energy than their aircraft. So essentially, you'd get the same RCS measurement whether the plane was on the top of the pole or not. So they offered to design a new pole for the Air Force. Years later, Alan learned from his counterpart at Northrop that was when they knew that they had lost the competition, as they knew that the Northrop aircraft would have a significant RCS as compared to just the bare pole. In 2015, I arranged for Alan to speak at the Aero Club of Northern California, which is an affiliate of NAA, the National Aeronautic Association. I presented him with the NAA's Certificate of Merit, and the photo image that you'll see on this podcast is of me presenting him with that award. I thought that I'd saved a copy of his presentation, but apparently I didn't. I did find a photo that I took of one of his slides, which was titled F-117, A Design Philosophy. The slide had two major bullets. The first was titled, "We have two difficult design areas, stealth and flight control," and below that it says, "This will be the first operational aircraft with an extremely low radar cross-section and the first aircraft which will be designed to be unstable in both pitch and yaw. These are the areas where we should concentrate our inventiveness." And the second bullet below it read, "The rest of the airplane will be designed as conservatively as possible," and below that it said, "Minimum use of composites. Components will be taken from other programs wherever possible. No inventions in areas where adequate solutions exist." And finally it says, "Note the benefits of having an experienced staff as well as a competent one." Now, along those lines, I remember another story that Alan told me, which is when they were first building the prototype and later the F-117, when they would send designs out to the shop to be built, the teams that were building the prototypes would do it similar to how they were used to building traditional aircraft, and they would come back with what they had modified in Alan's design, and he would tell them, "Please stop trying to help us do it the way that we're telling you to do it, because this is a revolutionary design and it needs different kinds of manufacturing techniques than we use on our traditional aircraft." Now, I also have a page of notes that I put together around the time that I interviewed Alan. He talked about a few of these topics during the interview, but here are my notes on some things he didn't mention in the interview. He talked about the U-2 aircraft as being not stealthy, but there was a proposal to look at putting wires around the plane that would essentially use capacitive coupling and out-of-phase cancellation to dramatically reduce the radar cross-section of the aircraft. However, all the wires around the airplane would bring its maximum altitude down by about 10,000 feet. So it officially flies up at 68,000 feet, so it just wasn't practical to try and modify a conventional airplane for stealth. Instead, they would have to design an all-new airplane with stealth as part of the original design. He also mentioned that they had 6 Cray computers. These are $1 million high-power computers at Lockheed. And he said that 5 of the 6 computers were dedicated to running their RCS measurements. That's how computing intensive the task was to try and compute the designs that they used on the stealth fighter. I also have some notes about Kelly Johnson. He said that he was a good designer. He was the first of the modern program managers who would combine engineering design at a high level with program management. He said he came up with 14 rules of operation of the Skunk Works. Simplicity of operation, don't walk into a contract and feel that you have to obey every one of the Air Force requirements. People should be rewarded for getting by with half the same as normal. He said the smaller the team, the better it would be. And he also talked about the original P-80 fighter that was built in the World War II timeframe. He said that from design to first production aircraft was just 143 days. So some pretty remarkable things that they had done at Lockheed in the early years. Alan also said that the F-15 took 5 years to put into production. He was asked to get the F-117 into production in 1.5 years, and he actually did it in 2.5 years, which he felt was quite an accomplishment compared to what was done with the F-15. So all I can say is Alan was an absolutely brilliant aeronautical engineer. It was so much fun to talk to. I miss him tremendously, and may he rest in peace. Coming up next, a couple of your emails right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. First, here are a couple of emails from Andrew Dury regarding helicopter wake turbulence issues, and we've talked about this on a number of different shows. This is really a big issue. Helicopters throw out tremendous amounts of wake turbulence, and they are something to be avoided, especially when you're low to the ground, such as when taking off and landing and there's no room to recover. Andrew writes, "Hi Max, regarding your discussion of helicopter wake issues, for 35 years I was based at the Wilmington Airport, where Boeing had their flight test facilities. Choppers they had worked on at their facility by the Philly airport were brought down for testing. We saw lots of Ospreys, Chinooks, etc. Once a Chinook had done an approach to the runway, I was landing on runway 32, and after assuring I had the required distance, the tower cleared us to land, caution wake turbulence. The helicopter was just setting down at the Boeing ramp, the far end of 32, and as we fled, we probably rolled at least 60 degrees. It felt vertical. We recovered and landed, should have gone around, but I was young and foolish." And then a few days later, Andrew submitted this follow-up message. He said, on COPA, that's the Cirrus Owner Pilots Association online forum, on COPA today there is an update for a crash at a local field where my Cirrus instructor works. That's Ed Waters, and here's his response. This accident happened to a high-time 1,000 hours plus Cirrus pilot who was landing on runway 23 at sunset while a helicopter was either transitioning the area pattern or doing a low approach on the ILS to runway 5. This is my home airport, and we had been going beak to beak with Apaches from the 82nd this afternoon. I departed 2 hours prior to RDU, I think that's Raleigh-Durham, with an Embark SR20 owner. The pilot was 5 to 10 feet above the runway and recovered from the initial roll when his nose was slammed down from the wake and broke off the nose wheel. The wreckage is on the right side of the runway on this one. At the moment, this appears to be a wake turbulence event from the helicopter. I must have 150 hours in this plane, and it was an immaculate late model G1 Cirrus. I'm really saddened to lose this beautiful bird. And then Andrew says that his new home is Raleigh-Durham, that there are a bunch of National Guard helicopters, and of course to the south towards Fort Bragg there's also a lot. And he says, thanks for bringing this potential risk to our attention. And here's an email from Patreon supporter Paul Skiveland. He says, hello Max, I'm a DPE, that would be an examiner, in Minnesota, and I listened to your podcast 232 with Catherine Cavagnaro on my way to an instrument rating certification. What timing that podcast was. When the applicant and I got to the point in the exam where we discussed personal minimums, the applicant said that he had never heard of them. Somewhat shocked and surprised, we discussed what they are and why we do them. I asked him what weather he thought he would be comfortable flying in. He said, well, that depends on how bad I need to get there. How important is the meeting? That led to him telling me that he would be comfortable with 2,000-foot ceilings and 3-mile visibility for takeoff, but felt comfortable with posted minimums for approaches. I said you'd be comfortable flying an ILS approach to 200 feet and 1/2 mile of visibility. He said proudly, yes. I asked him how much actual instrument time he had, and his answer was 0.4 hours. I said to him, well, that isn't very much experience, is it? He answered with, well, I fly a lot of Microsoft Flight Sim, so I'm very comfortable with low minimums. At this point, I wondered to myself if Max and Catherine were hiding in the closet punking me and waiting to jump out and yell it was a prank. Unfortunately, that was not the case, and unfortunately this applicant went home with a 8060-5 notice of disapproval form, and his flight instructor got a nice long debriefing from me, along with strong encouragement to listen to your podcast. Keep up with the great guests and the wide scope of topics. And I wrote back to Paul and said, that's a great story, but very sad that an instrument rating candidate had not heard of personal minimums. His answer of, well, that depends on how badly I need to get there, sounds nearly identical to the story that Catherine told. And what a shame it is that so many people think that it's okay to compromise safety simply because there's a more compelling reason to go make a flight. So yes, personal minimums are just that. They don't change just because you feel like you have a really compelling reason to fly. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.